And now I will kick today's event off by introducing our speaker, Caroline Auerkirk. Caroline spent 15 years as a student, staff member, and instructor at 3 of the nation's top 10 research universities, the University of Chicago, the University of Pennsylvania, and Johns Hopkins University, creating social impact and leadership development programs for students before launching her coaching practice in 2019 to support early career and social impact professionals. Caroline runs a leadership development program and community for emerging leaders in social impact, and partners with universities and companies to offer dynamic workshops on topics including navigating the social impact landscape and managing imposter syndrome. She also offers private career and confidence coaching to help clients find fulfilling work that maximizes their talents while creating space for all of their other priorities. Previously, Caroline was the assistant director of the Johns Hopkins University Center for Social Concern and was a lecturer in the Center for Leadership Education at the Hopkins Whiting School of Engineering, teaching courses on leadership, social impact, and social entrepreneurship. Caroline was the founding program director of the University of Chicago Urban Network, an interdisciplinary research initiative connecting faculty, students, and others working on urban issues. Caroline received her AB in history from the University of Chicago and her master's in higher education administration from the University of Pennsylvania. She also has a certificate in creative writing from the Graham School and a certificate from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business Executive Program for Emerging Leaders. You can find her online at www.talktocaroline.com, which I will again drop in the chat right now. And without further ado, I will toss it over to Caroline.
Excellent. Thank you so much for having me, Andy, and I am delighted to be here. I am really excited to be sharing this workshop with you today. I know that I have a workbook that Andy will be dropping in or sharing with you all shortly, so just be on the lookout for that. But if you will be leaving some time at the end for questions, so please feel free to drop those when you think of them. So with that, let's get started. So what we're going to talk about today is we'll be talking about why the social impact sector is growing and especially what directions it's growing into. We're going to talk about what the field looks like and what kinds of things you can expect when looking for a social impact job. We'll talk about how to break into the sector. And then, as I mentioned, we'll have some time at the end for some questions. As I also mentioned, there's a workbook. We have noticed that Zoom is stopping allowing you to attach files in the chat. So you can grab that on my website so that you can just download that right now. And it's got some resources and some links that might help you make the most of this presentation. If you happen to be watching the recording of this, it's still up there, so help yourself. Okay, so why am I here? So this workshop is really exciting to me because I spent the first part of my career working in universities and specifically working with college students, helping them get involved in social impact and civic engagement. And I had so many conversations with so many students who really felt like they were making a choice between either having a job that fulfilled their values and help them feel like they were contributing to making the world a better place, or a job that paid the bills and allowed them to maybe eventually someday, do philanthropy, but was leaving them exhausted and depleted with no time to actually do anything that they wanted to do. And I would say that over the last 15 or 20 years, the social impact sector has absolutely exploded. So I'm really excited to be talking about this today and kind of teasing this out a little bit. This picture right here is a picture of me with some of my students outside of where the University Community Service Center at UChicago used to be, by the parking garage of 55th and Ellis. But now I think it's somewhere else on campus. So anyway, so just waving a shout out to all of my awesome students there. I wanted to also share a little bit about what I'm doing today. So after I left the university, I started working specifically with social impact professionals, mostly because it was former students who were coming to me and they were really trying to figure out how to move away from the sort of classic nonprofit space that they'd been in and find more ways to make an impact with their jobs. And so I really developed this kind of special focus on social impact and sustainability, and have been helping coach clients to find jobs that are more in line with their values. So that's why I am here today. And one of the other things I do when I'm not working with clients is I work with a corporate social responsibility and sustainability consulting firm based out of Amsterdam called Reconsidered. And one of the things that I do for Reconsidered is help source social impact job opportunities for an impact jobs curation we put together every other week. And I'll talk a little bit more about Reconsidered because it can be a really helpful resource in helping find a social impact job. But one of the things that I've found as I've been sourcing jobs for this curation is just that there are so many more social impact jobs out there than I really even knew, even after having spent a decade in the profession. So that's really what I want to talk about today, is just how many jobs are out there and how diverse the sector is. We do kind of three things. We've got the consulting, we've got a biweekly newsletter, and then we have a really robust LinkedIn group, and then the Social Impact Jobs Hub, but more on that later. Okay, so we've got a couple of goals for today. One is that I really want to talk about breaking the binary, right? So it's not either change the world or pay the bills. It can be both. And I want to talk a little bit about how what that can look like, and the sort of nuances that are present in the social impact field today. I want to talk about the guilt. So I talk with a lot of clients who have been in the social impact sector, who have been especially in more traditional nonprofits, and they feel a deep sense of guilt about moving away from that and trying to find jobs that are with higher salaries and better paying. And I think that it's really important to be clear that you're not a terrible person for wanting to get paid more money. The nonprofit sector in particular is notorious for being underpaid and undervalued. And I really think that a more serious conversation needs to be had about that, and about how we rethink this whole sector. But I also think it's really important to mention that that more and more people's jobs are having a social impact component. And so we're seeing the spread from just having all of the jobs that care about the world sequestered in the nonprofit sector to being really sort of everyone's responsibility. So I want to talk about that as well. One other goal I have for today is to cut through some of the jargon. There are a lot of terms that get thrown around in this field, and they're often used kind of interchangeably when they do mean different things. And so I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about the words we're using. And then I want to talk about how to get started, because that's the most common question that folks have. So with that, let's see. I'm assuming you're here today because you want to shift something in your career. So perhaps you're currently working at a nonprofit and you're realizing that your current trajectory is not going to meet your financial goals. Or maybe you're working at a company and are starting to realize that their work and business decisions don't align with your values. Or maybe you're watching the news and are wondering why we're not doing more to address some of these pressing global issues. So whatever your reason for being here, I first want to say thanks for joining us. And I secondly want you to listen to this webinar with an eye towards identifying one action that you can take to shift your career to one of greater impact and alignment with your values and goals. So what's one small step that you can take within the next 48 hours? And there's space in that workbook to kind of do some brainstorming and write it down when you land on it. Okay, so with that, let's dive into it. So why is the social impact sector growing and diversifying? So to understand what this field looks like, it's really helpful to understand some of the context of why it's expanded so rapidly. So what we're seeing in particular is a shift to a triple bottom line. So the classic business decision of a single bottom line of maximizing profit for shareholders, from that to a triple bottom line of maximizing value to considering more of the broader social, economic, and environmental impacts and returns on investment. So we've got this people, planet, and profit. That's what we're really seeing the shift to. And it's really been exploding rapidly over the last, for sure the last 30 years, but especially the last 10 or 15. So this is really being driven by customer demand, customer and stakeholder demand. So with the rise of social media, with the internet, with sort of this increased ability to send information so quickly, we're seeing greater transparency in how products are made, how workers are treated, the impact that the manufacturing processes have on the environment. And so it's easier than ever to hold an organization accountable. And customers are really looking for values alignment. They're wanting to purchase with their dollars or to have their values and their dollars align. So we're really seeing this push from customers to businesses to hold them accountable. We also have a marketing angle to this, right? So businesses are noticing that customers are demanding this. And so sometimes these efforts can play out as more of a marketing tactic. So we use the term greenwashing. There are other terms as well, but this idea of a business really paying lip service or just talking about impact and mission as a way of attracting customers, or deflecting from really serious harmful effects that they are having through their processes. But it can sometimes be used to distract customers from other impacts of the business or as a marketing ploy, like look at all these great things that we've done. You'll see also some of these sustainability and social impact efforts as part of goodwill generation. So it's an advertising tactic, look at us donating product in kind during a disaster to help generate some feel-good stories and get some press. It can be used to offset some problematic activities. And then also we've got some efforts from companies to reduce tax burdens through donations and corporate sponsorships and foundations and things like that. We've also seen the rise relatively recently of new kinds of legal structures that actually made it possible to have to maximize other returns on investment beyond shareholder returns, right? So we're seeing in particular the rise of BCorps, and we'll talk about that more in a second. But this is a shift where before, there was the legal obligation that you're maximizing the shareholder value, and now with other legal structures, now those legal structures can better enable the company to be held accountable to reporting on other metrics beyond economic or investment metrics. And what you're also seeing is new companies being created with a social mission in mind from the ground up. With things like BCorps and other processes like that, there's more of a transparency and certification process. And so there's a more visible way to be held accountable to making these business decisions. Okay. So then we've got climate concerns as well. So customers are becoming increasingly savvy about the impact of production of the goods that they're using, especially in certain industries like fashion, furniture manufacture, and paper. So in order to retain customers, companies are needing to adapt. And then this is also being driven by governmental regulations where you're seeing specific requirements about environmental impacts being delivered, and then companies needing to adjust how they manufacture goods in order to comply. This is a rapidly growing part of the field. So the other piece that I want to kind of mention on why this is happening is that I believe there's a broader shift from a charity approach to an asset-based approach. So with funding always tight, you're starting to see organizations and nonprofits in particular get really creative with how they generate funds that they need to support the programs that they're offering for communities in need. So what you're seeing is, rather than a charity-based approach where you're collecting resources, you're starting to see nonprofits and social enterprises crop up where they're doing revenue-based, they have revenue streams that are allowing them to generate income that supports their programs. This is also connected to the concept of circularity, which is where waste products are reinvented as material, among other things. But it helps reduce waste and can create new product lines. So two of my favorite examples of this are tater tots, which were used they were invented basically as a way to use waste cuttings from potatoes that were being used for French fries. And Rothy's. So Rothy's, if you don't know them, they're the most comfortable shoes you can possibly buy. And they're made from recycled plastic bottles that are, in many cases, ocean plastic. And then the plastic is spun into threads that are then used to make these shoes, which are washable because they're made of plastic, and they're fantastic. And so these are two examples of taking a waste product and using it to create a completely new revenue stream. Okay, so that was a lot, but the bottom line is that we're starting to see this shift throughout all sectors, and it's especially driven by consumer demand for businesses that align with their values, and a way to get more creative with how funding is distributed. So with that in mind, let's get to the meat of it, of what does this field actually look like? What does this growing field actually look like? So I'm going to run through a whole bunch of different kinds of definitions here so that we can get a lay of the land. And I want to talk a little bit about the different types of impact organizations. So the traditional approach is for-profit versus nonprofit. And it's very binary, right? So the main concept here in a for-profit is that you've got a company that sells an item or provides a service, the user pays for it, the company generates revenue, which gets distributed to shareholders or owners, okay? In the nonprofit, our traditional understanding is that it does not exist to make money, and it usually provides something like shelter, food, education for free or a low cost to the user, and someone else pays, like donors or the government, right? So you've got this kind of distributed model here. But the title of this workshop is Beyond Nonprofits. So I really want to dig into this a little bit more. A couple of years ago in my social entrepreneurship class, I had a guest speaker come in to give a lecture on social enterprise. And he said this sentence to my students, and it just blew my mind. He said, nonprofit is a tax structure, not a business model. And that, I think, it's just really what the focus of this whole conversation is, right? So we've got some fantastic, we've got some nonprofits that are classified as nonprofits, but can generally be argued as doing a lot of harm. And we can have companies that exist to make profit that do a lot of good, right? So nonprofit in and of itself is not a helpful term for understanding the impacts that an organization is having on the world, right? So nonprofit is a tax structure, not a business model. And this man was running an organization in Baltimore that trains formerly incarcerated individuals to deconstruct houses that are slated for demolition. So the house is already going to be demolished, but the organization trains folks to take the house apart piece by piece by piece and save that material from the landfill, because otherwise you would just run a bulldozer through it and throw it in the dumpster. But instead they take it apart, and then they're able to resell that material in this massive warehouse they have in South Baltimore, which then generates income that they're able to use to pay for job training programs for the people who are working on site there. The consumer chooses this organization over another vendor because they're able to basically write off the cost of the donation of the house, because they're donating the house and then they're paying for the service of getting it demolished. And so it's a win-win for everybody. They're diverting, a significant amount of material from the landfill. They're able to pay folks and do job training programs, and then they're able to provide a service that is fee for service. And I think the last number I got on them was that they were generating about $10 million a year in fee for service. So definitely can make serious money and make that happen. So tax structure, not a business model. So let's talk about some other terms that are beyond nonprofits, right? So to start, many of us I'm sure have heard of foundations, but to make sure we're on the same page, a foundation is usually an organization that has significant financial resources that invests in programs or initiatives, usually other nonprofits, that in order to advance specific goals. So it can be privately funded by an individual or a family, or funded by a corporation, and it can be used as a way to divert income to minimize the tax burden. So it's closely linked to personal philanthropy. Of course, this is a University of Chicago webinar, so we need to mention that one of the most significant individual philanthropists ever was University of Chicago donor, John D. Rockefeller, who's widely credited with laying the groundwork for how significant individual wealth can be donated through foundations and philanthropic initiatives. Just want to mention that as well. It's really a 20th century kind of movement. So back on the for-profit side of things, we have several terms to consider. So corporate social responsibility is usually a term for a department or a set of initiatives within a business that's focused on managing the business's impacts on people and the environment. It's often a catch-all term, and it really can vary widely from one business to another. But it's usually and it's often a very individual, you'll find one person whose job it is to do corporate social responsibility work. And I've actually started gathering together these folks who are sort of one person on an island in community to help people connect with each other and figure out ways to share resources. So if that's you, I want to hear from you. Okay, moving on. So B Corps. So B Corps are a formally recognized structure. So there's both benefit corps, which are a type of legal tax structure that exists in some states, but not all, where there's a certain, it's along the same lines of incorporating as an LLC, or so you can be a benefit corp, or other kinds of structures, S corp, that kind of thing. But B Corps, as B Corps, is a term that belongs to an organization that is international, and they work to certify different kinds of companies, and so it's a very rigorous process to get your B Corp certification to be proving that you're maximizing value for people, planet, and profit. I have some logos here of some of the most famous B Corps, but there are hundreds of them. So it's a really interesting movement that's been growing rapidly, especially in conjunction with this legal tax structure that's been able to make that happen. But Patagonia is one of the Patagonia and Ben & Jerry's are two of the most famous B Corps out there. So we've got social enterprise. So social enterprise is not a regulated term, but it usually refers to an organization that generates revenue with an intention to reinvest the profits to further the mission of the organization. So it can be for-profit, it can be nonprofit. This is a picture of one of my favorite social enterprises, which is in Chicago. It's called Open Books. They sell used books to fund literacy programming. Again, we've got that common theme of revenue stream, diverting waste, and providing services. Definitely recommend checking them out if you are in Chicago. Okay, mission-driven businesses. So this is a really unregulated term. It's usually related to marketing. It can describe a business that's aligning its efforts around a larger goal or vision, but you might also see it as a purpose-driven business, but it really is it's just a broad term designed to describe or convey the feeling that a company is thinking about a larger impact. Okay, so I know we're going through all this really rapidly, but I want to make sure that we can get to some questions at the end. So this ESG is one of the biggest, hottest terms in this field right now. So ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. This is about talking, this is talking about data on other factors beyond financial that may affect investments in a company. So we're looking at environmental impacts. We're looking at social, meaning human rights, labor standards, community relations, diversity. And then we've got governance, which is around lobbying efforts, internal controls, whistleblower programs, leadership structure. This is by far the fastest growing within the sector. So you're seeing a lot of growth happening, especially at the larger consulting firms. So PwC, PricewaterhouseCoopers, announced that they were hiring 100,000 new staff just for ESG over the next 5 years to support reporting and analysis. This is connected to reporting frameworks, disclosure reports that are coming out every year. There's a lot of work happening in this field, and it's just exploding right now. Okay. So then we got sustainability, which is many of us have probably heard of this term before, but it often refers to more of the environmental aspect of things. So what's the impact of the business on the environment? How can we make it less of a burden on the environment? But really this idea of how can we keep things sustainable so that we don't deplete all the resources that are going into this. And then it's also growing significantly, especially since 2005, when the UN announced the Sustainable Development Goals, which were designed to focus the efforts more, globally around the different levers to push to create sort of a better world. And this is something that has been really effective in getting lots of engagement and involvement. It's connected to grant programs, it's connected to conferences and getting thinkers together. But it's a really powerful thing. And you're seeing lots of different organizations connect to the Sustainable Development Goals. So if that's not on your radar, I definitely recommend checking it out. Okay. So we're going to move into some trends in the field. And in particular, I already mentioned this. So we're especially seeing that ESG sector growing rapidly. And I saw that there was a comment about what kind of work actually goes on in ESG. So that's a great question. It's a little bit, there's a bunch of different things that are under the realm of ESG. There was actually a paper that came out, or an article that came out over the summer called "The War for ESG Talent," that was talking about just this massive rise in companies hiring for ESG. And what's happening in particular is that you're seeing reporting, right? So reporting on the ways that a company is in compliance or not in compliance with the different sectors that, so the article that I just mentioned is actually linked in the workbook that I was talking about earlier. So I've included links to all of these things. But I was actually over the summer, I also included a link in that workbook to a panel that I was part of over the summer that specifically focused on ESG and the hiring trends within ESG. But basically you're seeing, companies looking through, hiring people to look through filings on reporting data on environmental impacts. How is it, everything from water, soil, pollution to, sort of how is the company's, how are the company's processes affecting actual environmental impacts? Then you're talking about the social end of things, which is reporting on diversity initiatives, composition of the workforce. This in my opinion, the social piece of ESG is the least developed and there's the most room for growth right now. The environmental piece is really, there's a lot going on there, and definitely, but the people aren't talking as much about the social piece. So I would predict that that's going to explode relatively soon, where you're talking about more, everything from hiring practices to increase diversity within your workforce, to making sure that trainings and other efforts to support the staff. You can sometimes see well-being lumped in there as well, to talk about how employees are, what retention efforts look like, are they burning out, that kind of thing. And then governance, you're starting to see a growth in alternative governance structures and how does the company make decisions? It's a really, so this shows up in people writing reports for shareholders, so needing to compile the data and run the reports. You're seeing this in terms of investment firms deciding or reading these reports and deciding which companies to invest in. And then you're also seeing that play out in B2B marketing, efforts to help companies improve those metrics to drive the other lines of business. It's a really interesting field. We could do a whole workshop just on that. You can also see the link to the one that we did over the summer. So again, there's a huge growth, and what's in particular really interesting is that you're seeing a need for people with more years of experience, but because the field is so new, and that you're seeing people who don't have those years of experience because the field didn't exist or is emerging. And so we're going to be seeing a lot of opportunity for reskilling people who have the content or the subject matter expertise, but not necessarily the expertise in the other, like in the social impact end of things. And so there's a really big opportunity for growth, especially on that end of things. But there's also a need for people with management experience who are able to, as companies decide to invest more and more in this realm, you're starting to see people build out teams. So whereas before, maybe if a company had someone, it was one or two people, but now they're starting to build out and get more sophisticated. And so you're going to need people who have management skills to be able to supervise more frontline staff who are doing these actual initiatives. So that's also an opportunity for growth. And then there's a huge scientific component. So especially in the sustainability and environmental end of things, but there's this need for people to understand the science behind the decision-making that's happening. And so you're starting to, that's increasingly becoming something that people need to be able to speak to when they're looking for these kinds of roles. So that's definitely a huge area of opportunity if you have scientific training or data analysis training to be able to use that in this sector. Okay, so what kinds of jobs are out there? And I kind of alluded to some of these, but I just pulled a whole bunch of opportunities that just these are some recent ones that I've seen within the social impact field. But you can see the range, right? So we're talking about big name companies, Peloton, Pinterest, Under Armour, and just the kind of range of job titles that are coming within the social impact space. You can see philanthropy, government and public affairs, sustainability, social impact, corporate social responsibility, the whole range. And this is coming from the jobs curations that I mentioned earlier in the session, where I pull together job postings for Reconsidered every other week, and so I'm seeing these opportunities, and they're global. So we've got opportunities all over the world, but it's really exploding in terms of there's no one job title that really conveys what we're talking about here, right? So there's an opportunity for all of us here. And I think we're just getting started, right? So there's a lot of different as you can see, there's a lot of different terms at play. There's not a standard terminology. And I predict that it's going to get more defined, but it's also important to remember that this is just getting started and it's getting much bigger every year. And the most important takeaway, I think, is that there's room for everyone here. It's going to require all of us to come together to make this kind of impact. And so there is a space for you within this realm. All right, so let's talk about how to transition to a job in social impact. So I've got some 6 big takeaways here. So the first one is always to start with some reflection. So I often have clients meet with me and say, I want a more fulfilling job. And my challenge to them is always, what does more fulfilling look like, right? Why do you care about social impact, right? Why does this matter for you? And then in particular, this idea of a theory of change. So what of this makes the most sense to you, right? How do you think that change is going to happen? And how can you make that into your unique angle that you contribute when you're taking leadership positions or when you're talking in interviews and in your materials? But what's your theory of change? Because it really is, we're starting to see this need for people who have sector experience, but also a real leadership skill to be able to articulate what they see. I've talked a little bit more about both the more fulfilling piece and the theory of change in some of the other webinars that I've done for the University of Chicago. So you can check those out. And then they've got some more insights on that as well. I also encourage folks to focus on their value add. So being able to articulate what your unique set of skills is absolutely crucial, right? So it's not helpful, or it's not going to get the job to say, I care about the environment, or we got to stop global warming. It's what are your unique skills, and what's the contribution that you make to the organization? It's crucial to follow the news on all of this. So both because the things are changing so rapidly at the environmental and sort of international intergovernmental level, but there's just so much happening in the space. And so I just really encourage folks to stay current on what's going on in the field. And I've got some links to different resources in the workbook, but in particular, you'll see, I already mentioned Reconsidered, but we've got a newsletter that comes out every other week that has sort of the top 5 articles that you need to know about in the social impact field, and that can be really helpful. There's lots of other similar newsletters that really help share, help you stay current. You can follow folks on LinkedIn and follow these topics. There's a lot happening on Twitter as well, climate Twitter. But it's just really important, because the field is changing so rapidly, to keep your eyes peeled for what's going on. You may want to consider some skill building and certification. So I have a link to, there's a lot of certifications in the social impact space, particularly on the sustainability end of things. And so I definitely, it can be worth considering one of those certifications to taking one of those certifications to kind of enhance your skills and get, especially on the more scientific end of things. The answer is not always grad school. There are other ways to get that training. But that can be a really helpful thing. And I included a link to a guide to the top 25 sustainability certification programs, so that you can see that as a resource as well. But there are also other ways to build skills. So Coursera and similar LinkedIn Learning have a lot of resources like that, where you can develop these trainings. But my recommendation there is always to look at the people who have the roles that you're interested in, and build a bit of a reverse resume to kind of understand where the gaps are in your skill set. Okay, and the last and most important piece of how to transition into a social impact job is to start where you are. So you don't necessarily need to switch jobs to work on social impact in the social impact sector. I've had clients carve out new roles at their existing organizations that allow them to spend more time on sustainability, ESG, and CSR work, right? So this can look a lot of different ways. I mean, it can look like starting to ask questions about the sustainability and environmental impacts of the work you're doing. It can look like developing a corporate volunteering program. If you're working at a more classic nonprofit, it can look like starting to explore ways to leverage the organization's resources to generate income for the organization and get closer to that social entrepreneurship model. So there's a lot of different things that you can do just right where you are. If none of those sound good to you, you can also always join a nonprofit board and learn about board leadership, about contributions that way. And in many cities, there are leadership development programs specifically designed to help place talented professionals in board leadership positions. And that can be an amazing way to get some of that social impact expertise as well. So I think that it's really just important to start where you are. I mean, it can look as simple as, and important, right, as advocating for recycling bins in the office, right? So you can do what you can where you are. It can look like curating interesting articles on LinkedIn and sharing them with your network. But there are so many different ways to speak to the social impact space. You don't need to just completely switch jobs. Okay, and then, so as for where to actually find these roles, so I've included some of these links in the workbook that I dropped, but there are some really helpful folks on Twitter and LinkedIn, some LinkedIn influencers. Katie Cross in particular and Nick Martin post, and Craig Zelizer post social impact jobs all the time. I mentioned the reconsidered jobs curation that I put together. And then there's a meta list of social impact jobs boards that is also super helpful. But there's lots of really great resources out there. And as I said, it's just exploding. So every week they're better. Okay, so with that, there's so much to talk about here, but I really want you to take away from this that the impact roles are being incorporated into every sector. Everyone sort of needs to think about this. And as we transition into the Q&A, I just want to encourage you to jot down one action you'd like to take within the next 48 hours to move closer to an impact career. Whether that's to reach out to someone, to sign up for a newsletter, set aside time to do some more research, whatever it is, but one action you can take. So for more information, you can download the workbook. You can check out my website. I have more webinars on my website as well. And you can, welcome to schedule a free first session with me if you'd like to talk more about personalized supports. I also have a self-paced online course that talks about social impact, finding your first social impact job. And then let's see, some previous webinars on imposter syndrome, standing out from the crowd, and making networking less awkward, which are also super fun. Okay, so with that, I'd like to turn it back to Andy, and we'll be moderating some questions that we've had come up from the audience. Happy to answer anything except for why Steve the kitten is in the dishwasher. I just don't know.
Well, thank you so much, Caroline. I feel like I've learned a lot already, and we have some great questions coming in. We've got two pretty similar questions that came in. I'm going to read them now. It says, I'm mid-career and have spent the majority of my career in nonprofits. I tend to find that I get screened out for roles in companies, in for-profit companies, that while nonprofits love people who come from the corporate world, the corporate role doesn't always see how the nonprofit applicant skills will transfer. And then someone else asks, like, how can someone with strong nonprofit philanthropy background position themselves for a CSR impact role? It feels like a lot of companies value corporate experience over nonprofit experience. So you touched on this a little bit, but can you talk more about, like, what does a resume look like for trying to get for-profit attention?
Yeah, so so it's definitely really tricky. So a couple of things that might be really helpful are around the two mid-career folks, a really helpful strategy can sometimes be to connect with recruiters. So being able to, turning on your LinkedIn profile to connect with recruiters, and especially starting to do some of that kind of bit as well can be really helpful. Anything that you can talk about in terms of creating value. So remembering that companies are focused on return, the returns on investment, and what's the value add there. It can be really helpful to speak to how you've been able to create value for your organization, whether it was nonprofit or for profit. So talking about that, being able to demonstrate some of those quantitative skills and data analysis skills can be really helpful. And then networking. So especially if you're looking at a role at a Fortune 500 company, you need to get an internal referral. So that's a really helpful way to get started. But it's because so many people are trying to move into these relatively small departments in corporate, it can be really difficult. So sometimes looking at smaller organizations can help you make that move. I talk a lot about that a lot more in the Make Networking Less Awkward webinar, but it can be really helpful to start a little bit smaller, and then go that way as well. Yeah, so recruiters, maximizing value, and maybe looking at organizations that are less obvious can be really helpful too.
Great. And then someone asked, you talked about, sort of continuing skill building, but someone asked specifically how important are DEI certifications if someone wants to peruse roles in ESG?
Yeah. So again, it really depends on the organization. My advice for all of this is to go back to that reverse resume concept, where you're looking at ways to reverse engineer the resume that you need to have from the kinds of jobs that you're looking at. So this is especially helpful if you have access to professional development funds, like looking at the role like 2 or 3 levels above you, and sort of where you want to go, and then reverse engineering the gaps from here. DEI certifications. I think that one big thing in the space is really about, so 2 things. One is I would look at people that you admire in the space and see what they've got, right? And start to look at how you can match what people that are doing the jobs that you want to have. The other thing is that I think it can be really helpful to think about what your special sauce is, right? So where do you want to differentiate? If everybody's got this kind of certification, is there a way that you can position an alternative as a value add, right? So that can be really helpful. And then kind of, if you're looking at a certification and you're like, I will do anything, nobody regrets getting more training on quantitative analysis and data skills. And then the sort of more classical scientific training certifications. There is there's a lot of space there for the more like being in compliance with different kinds of standards trainings as well. So I highly recommend those kinds of things. How can you differentiate, right? What's your value add? And then I saw that there was another one here. I think a really great question of how can we tell whether a position is to help greenwash a company's reputation? So, okay. So this is a really great question. And it's hard to tell, right? Obviously, that's part of the problem. But a couple of things to think about. So in particular, thinking about what kinds of questions you can ask during the interview stage that will help you determine whether this organization, like where this organization's values lie, right? So talking about maybe asking questions about the history of how they got to this decision of hiring staff to take, how do they make decisions on what kinds of projects to invest in? that kind of thing. You're probably, I mean, there are some really great, I think that the greenwashing thing in particular is a really interesting one because it's being called out more and more. We had a great image on Reconsidered's website a couple of months ago where it was like a bottle that was like, this is not a plastic bottle. And then you cut it open and it was absolutely a plastic bottle, and kind of talking about that, and people are being called out a lot more on that. So it's hard, but I think that that's really where you can talk to people and you can see, you know, are the people on staff people you respect, right? Are they talking about, one of the things that I think is super interesting about social impact jobs and sustainability in particular is that you have this, it seems like there's much more of a tendency for people to be having a public persona outside of their company, right? So they're talking on Twitter or they're talking on LinkedIn about these values-based things, and then they're going to work and also doing that. And so I think it can be really helpful to like look at, you know, what's your future boss posting on LinkedIn? Is she posting about being interested in, you know, or like, is she posting about the things that matter to you? So that can be helpful too. Yeah. I don't know. So there's some really great questions here. I would love to talk about all these. Someday, Andy, we're going to just do a whole Q&A of questions. So how to implement a CSR and corporate philanthropy role. So at your current company, that's a super interesting thing. So kind of a couple of different pathways might be to figure out who might find the person who has the money and convince them. And I know that sounds kind of really glib, but like, that's kind of the bottom line, right? Which is who makes these kinds of decisions, right? So who's got the discretionary funding? So for years, CSR has been housed in marketing because those were the people who had the funding, right? To do things that were more experimental. So they were able to make decisions to put a banner behind a stage at the, you know, the community concert or whatever, because it kind of fell under the banner, you know, the guise of marketing because it was advertising, right? So that can be a really great place to start and say, you know, hey, have we ever thought about this kind of thing? It can be also really helpful to talk about if you have a product, right? That's marketing can be a really helpful place to start, right? And then it's about how do we develop spaces that are more equity focused and not just how can we move away from that charity model to one of impact, which is a whole different webinar, but one I would love to have as well. But you know, that idea of how do we do this from a social impact perspective versus just that charity deficit model, which is often where it has started. Yeah, I have done a webinar on that one too, but that is not, I don't think that one's available. So talking about some transferable skills, right? So transferable skills. So my big takeaway on transferable skills is always looking at, I have my clients often do a career exploration activity where I'm literally asking them to look at different job opportunities, not necessarily to apply to those job opportunities, but to pay attention to how they look at those job opportunities, right? That kind of metacognition of how am I looking at these things? But the most important thing that you can do is to approach these job postings, right? And looking at this bullet point list of all of these different skills that they require. And rather than looking at as a checklist to screen yourself out, I really want to encourage you to use it as a checklist to screen yourself in, right? So looking at the bullet point and saying, how might I claim that, right? Obviously, you need to work in complete integrity, right? You're not claiming things that you can't do, but rather than saying like, oh, I don't have that, it's what can I possibly talk about from my past life that would be relevant to this particular random bullet point, right? How might I mention that, right? And it really is that phrasing can be a really huge game changer, right? Where you're saying, how can I claim that? Yeah. So that's my big thing about transferable skills. I mean, there's a bajillion skills, but again, The other important thing there is don't just because you're good at a skill, right, doesn't mean that it needs to be part of your job. So don't look for jobs that involve skills that you don't like doing, right? Which, I mean, I could talk about that for forever, but I think that that's a really important thing to consider as well, of just because you can do that job doesn't mean you want to do that job. So just kind of putting that in perspective as well. Okay, Andy, I know that you're getting close, so I could talk about all this all day long, but anything else that we should mention before we wrap?
I think that between the questions that you answered and the amazing workbook that you've provided, that you covered most everything. I could also listen to you talk about this all day. I think that this is such an interesting topic, and clearly everyone is fascinated. I want to take a minute and thank you so much for being with us today and for agreeing to participate. I know that it's a busy time of year for everyone, so thanks to you and thanks to all of those who joined us. You'll see that I put in the chat a link to a short survey. It should take 2 minutes or less to fill that out if you want to give some feedback. We got a few questions on if this webinar is being recorded. It absolutely is, and we'll have a link to that recording up on our YouTube page later this week, and we'll send it out to all registrants. The link to the workbook I can drop again into the chat, and this will be included in that email as well. And we'll make sure that that's posted with the recording in perpetuity. So thank you again. As we're wrapping up Career Month, if there's anything else that you're interested in, please feel free to join us the rest of the week. And thank you again to Caroline for being with us today. So
thank you so much. And I know I saw, so the jobs boards, they're all in the, so my sort of tagline is I'm notorious for giving people resources. I have a newsletter that has nothing to do with, or it's not always about social impact. And it's, I'm notorious for giving people resources. Now there's an archive. This is what I got. So the links to the job boards are in the workbook as well. And yeah, feel free to check that out. And let me know if you have any feedback or any other resources to add for the next time. But thanks so much for having me. And yeah, check out some of those other resources as well.
Great. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great rest of your week.
Awesome. Take care.